Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel BNB Daily Spoiler. Everything changes. Liam discovers Eric working for Katie.
Bold and beautiful on Wednesday, February 4th. Liam discovers that Eric is Katie's new designer. Ridge feels terrible guilt. They shouted it on the Forrester floor as if it were a true rumor. Katie Logan. Katie Spencer by marriage and the small tenacious loyalty that kept people together had a new appearance and the city took notice. It began as a simple thing. A snapshot that circulated a charity dinner when everyone at the front table blinked at a dress that felt both impossibly futuristic and impossibly comfy. People in the street took note. Fashion weeks shared notes. However, the tremor that swept through the Forrester offices when a name tied to that garment. Not a trendy freelancer, not a star stylist, but Eric Forrester. Emerged in the news releases was the type of human weather that rearranges rooms. Liam was the first to discover it, and he discovered it in the same way that you discover things that keep you awake, by mistake, by sound, or by an itch in the back of his neck. He was in the hospital early that day, just checking in and making a call, when his phone rang with a fluff story pushed out by a junior writer. He skimmed it for comedy, amused rather than scared, until his thumb caught the credit line. Eric Forrester. Designer. 4. Katie Logan. There was a moment when the globe shrank to the size of a single breath. Liam's mind raced through a dozen shorthand reactions, an unexpected headline, an unapproved partnership, the feeling that devotion, familial loyalty, had been pushed aside. He read it again, slowly. The post was pleasant and profitable in the way that city morning journalism frequently is. Pretty images, soothing language about reinvention, statements about being honored to collaborate. But beyond the PR, what gnawed at him was not logic. It was an old, tribal feeling. Someone had crossed a border that, in his mind, was both business and personal. He called Ridge. He phoned quickly because Ridge was the type of man who handled problems by conversation and the speedy deployment of family force. Ridge answered on the second ring, his voice harsh with caffeine and irritation. "What is going on?" Ridge requested. He was not the type of person who was taken aback by headlines. Rather, he was the type of person who generated headlines out of his problems and then solved them. "Is this real?" "Eric's preparing a capsule for Katie," Liam explained. "It's in the press. He is credited." Ridge's response was as brief as it was complete. "Eric, what?" They agreed to go to the Forrester loft in a hurry, smelling of shame and a bad plan. Ridge drove like a man with a pulse in his jaw, while Liam sat in the passenger seat, his brain buzzing. The Forrester house, which had hosted more conflicts and coffee breaks over the years, felt like a place that had been waiting to be remodeled for decades. When they found Eric, he was sitting peacefully in his study chair, palms folded over a cup of tea that he had not finished. He had the steady composure of a man who has been around long enough to recognize storms and know when you were the one sailing them. "Liam," Eric remarked with a little smile that was both compassionate and protective. "Good to see you. Do you design for Katie Logan?" Liam asked. He didn't feel like he was asking a question. He felt like he was making a revelation that necessitated compensation. Eric's face furrowed with astonishment, followed by a brief moment of remorse. "Yes," he answered simply. Liam felt the answer's simplicity in his bones, just like a storm front. "Why?" he stated. "Why her? Why now?" Eric folded his hands and steepled his fingers in the manner of a guy who has spent his entire life lecturing before returning to his teacherly voice. "She asked me, son," he explained, "because she wanted someone who understood clothing and was honest. Because, and this is key, we have a history that predates any news announcement. Katie needed a dress that suited her. She requested, and I agreed." Liam felt something in his throat, like a bruise. There were reasons to answer yes and no. There was the private ledger of family politics, Forrester versus Logan, and 1,000 echoes of runway versus family. But in the study, between the faded rugs and the volumes that smelled like old design, those phrases were suddenly insignificant. Ridge remained motionless with his arms folded for some minutes. The remorse that would eventually weigh heavily on him had not yet surfaced. Instead, he felt shock and a rising heat. He had always been the son who believed in the preservation of a specific way of life. The family, the label, and the restricted architecture that had made Forrester both magnificent and brittle. If Eric was designing outside of the house, the concern was corporate. If Eric was creating for Katie Logan, Ridge's fear was personal as well. Ridge eventually said, "Dad," and the word carried significant weight. Why? Why did you go and do this without informing anyone? Eric's gentle gaze at his son made Ridge want to forgive as well as attack. It is a particularly harsh trait in families, the ability to make moral claims against one another while ignoring the seat your own feet inhabit. "I didn't expect the secrecy to hurt," Eric explained. "I didn't expect a memo to be required when a buddy asks you to assist with selecting a hem. I thought, Ridge, that I could do something little and basic. Katie is my friend. She wanted to feel fresh. I gave her that." Ridge felt the speech like a scorching current, a moral electricity he couldn't contain. Ridge's chest tightened, not only because Eric had acted, but also because he remembered the conversation in which he had told Eric, some months earlier, that perhaps it was time to step back, that the company would be better managed by younger hands, and that the elder Forrester might find comfort in his legacy rather than in running the day-to-day. Ridge had said it with what he believed was compassion, but he had not intended the elderly man to interpret it as license to shrink. It is a simple tragedy to misinterpret how a loving senior perceives your desire. Ridge had intended to insulate Eric from the stress of business infighting, but Eric had heard something else, an olive branch disguised as an edict. Ridge's thoughts provided the recollection in fragments. Coffee, charts, Ridge's own practiced impatience. A rehearsal of parental practicality that, if he sat on it, resembled exile. Ridge felt the first pang of remorse as he looked at Eric in the study. For proposing Eric leave the center, for failing to anticipate his father's need to make himself felt in other rooms. Ridge's chest felt full of humiliation in the shape of the word selfish. "You told me to make space." Ridge responded, not accusing but acknowledging. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I never intended to make you feel uncomfortable in your own home." Eric's eyes, the odd gray of someone who has lived for decades and counting, softened. "I know you thought you were doing right, Ridge," he told me. "But your concept of rightness is pragmatic. Mine is stubborn. I wanted to sow. That is all." It was a modest, world-changing response, and Ridge felt the shame, not as a shout, but as an ache. He had been the architect of a decision he had framed as love, and he now recognized in a bone-deep register that love might sometimes be the most painful thing. Liam observed the conversation, feeling the weight of two men who loved the same place in different ways. He'd always been kind and generous, but he was ready to defend the shrine that is the Forrester legacy. He felt a protective instinct for both men. For Eric, because he was old and sentimental in the best sense, and for Ridge, because Ridge's concept of stewardship was partly his father's labor to pass along. The complicated thing about families, Liam reasoned, is that you can't keep two truths separate. Sometimes you value the work by retaining control, and sometimes you honor the work by allowing it to breathe. The day turned into a sequence of decisions that they would all come to regret, but also learn from. Ridge, who couldn't stand being the type of son who kicked his father out of the room, did what he usually did when he felt small. He tried to mend things in public. He sent a discreet statement to the Forrester board, describing Eric's cooperation as personal creative outreach, a phrase that seemed more like damage control than truth. He scheduled a special exhibition in the loft, where the outfit would be shown for a limited group of people. However, Ridge's guilt was not alleviated by remarks. It followed him home. It manifested itself in the minor actions of avoidance, the way he cleared his throat before entering Eric's study, as well as the short, private visits he began to make, which smelled like an apology. He began bringing Eric tea without being asked, sitting at the edge of the study and listening to stories Ridge had heard in many forms throughout his life. He found himself saying, in a much softer voice than usual, "Tell me about the fabric again." For Ridge, admitting error felt like a small, perilous step. It unlocked a door he had spent years shutting. He took pride in being able to make decisions and shepherd a company through difficult times. He also took satisfaction in being the son who could speak up for the family. To accept that his father's demand for order drove him to seek life elsewhere was to admit that his stewardship had served as a form of confinement. When word of the partnership got out of the Forrester household, it spread like wildfire around the city. Fashion critics praised the garment, which had Forrester's characteristic aggressive architecture softened by a sensitivity seen only when a designer is battling for someone's dignity. Katie, who had gone through her own arc of reinvention and had the grace that comes with surviving a public life, wore it to a charity luncheon and looked like a woman who had been recognized on her terms. Liam saw that portrait and had conflicted emotions, pride that Eric had created work that impacted people, and annoyance that the work was for another family's matriarch. He also felt the tug of something more tender, the potential that Eric, in designing for Katie, had discovered a way to return to making things that matter on his own terms. That idea concerned him because it required altering a map on which he had depended. The first public encounter occurred, as it often does in soap operas, at a charity event where rivals, friends, and family interact and rivals are willing to make dramatic asides. Ridge found himself standing alongside Katie. She was dazzling, strong, and sensible like older women are when they've decided what's important. She took Ridge's hand with a surprising warmth. "Ridge," she said gently, "you look troubled." Ridge gave a faint giggle that sounded like an apology. "I am," he admitted. "I think I might have misread something." I informed Eric, perhaps too frankly, that he needed to step back. I assumed I was sparing him the fight. Katie's expression became compassionate. "Oh, Ridge," she commented, "you spoke like a son. You wanted the house to be safe. But Eric is not a brand that can be bottled. He is a man who creates beauty for people to remember. He handed me that. I requested, and he provided it with his whole heart." Ridge's guilt did not disappear. It simply reframed. The agony shifted from an indictment against Eric to an admission to himself. His model of protection had been limited. He had tried to console himself by controlling his surroundings, but he now realized that control came at a cost. Eric aspired to be seen as a creator rather than a historical figure. If guiding the company required keeping the maker off the floor, Ridge had to decide if he wanted a company with a live, breathing founder or a museum piece in a leather chair. Later that night, Ridge went to the study with something less than a statement, but larger than a memo, a quiet apology. He discovered Eric at the drafting table, a pattern spread out like a map. The instruments of his grandfather's trade, shears, pencils, a spool of thread, appeared to be relics, but they were everything but. Eric looked up when Ridge entered. "I wanted to ask you for help," Ridge said, leaving him feeling like a practiced man stepping out of armor. "Not because I think you can't do your job, but because I thought I understood what was best for you and us. I made an error. I told you to step back. I didn't see how asking you to do less would cause you to seek another means to be noticed." Eric's face softened in a way that only time and love can achieve. "Ridge, I enjoy what you do. You safeguard the house. You keep it safe. But you must allow the house to breathe if it is to survive." He placed the pattern down, leaned forward, and held Ridge's hand. "You do not need to apologize so loudly. It's enough that you saw." Ridge's guilt did not vanish with that move, but it did begin to alter shape. It became a source of motivation rather than a poison of self-justification. In the following days and weeks, he resumed involving Eric in meetings, not as a token elder, but as a creative voice. He walked the studio floor with him, sat through an early morning drawing review, and even talked in public on how the Forrester house needed to blend its founding spirit with current stewardship. His apology was not a single sentence. It was a series of little deeds, including invitations, acknowledgments, and approval. Liam observed the repair with clarity that left him strangely wistful. He'd seen families split over less dramatic issues. He had also witnessed them reconcile over the slightest of graces. There was a bazaar in the city where injuries were frequently purchased as lessons. In Forrester's case, the purchase was more gradual: humility. The subsequent occurrence on Wednesday, dubbed the luncheon by the city's gossip channels as if lunches might be epical, was more delicate than any of them had anticipated. Katie stepped in front of the audience, speaking not about fashion, but about the boldness of older men and the merits of asking for aid. She spoke about Eric in ways that made him blush, as if a career of plaudits could turn a man inward. "You created something that made me feel whole," she added simply. "And for that, I thank you. I appreciate you telling me that we can always start over." When she concluded, there was a reserved, respectful applause reserved for persons who have truly impacted others, rather than the furious shout of commerce. Ridge stood at the back and felt a change under his stern ribs. He grabbed Eric's attention and saw the calm joy of a guy who had been identified as a force rather than a liability. After the occasion, while the press gadgets and city buzz roiled like a faraway ocean, the family met in the Forrester kitchen for coffee, as families do when they want to mend more than just their reputation. Ridge took Eric aside and said what every son must say: "I'm sorry. I love you. Do not stop creating beautiful things." Eric placed his hand on Ridge's shoulder, a small blessing. "I won't stop," he said. "I will continue to make gowns, make mistakes, and be stubborn. That is the point." Liam, observing the two of them, felt the mixed relief of someone who had feared the worst and discovered the possibility of better than he had imagined. Thousands of people read the headline Eric Forrester Designs for Katie, Friendship, Fabric, and the Family that appeared online the next morning. Some would cheer, some would scowl, and some would describe it as a betrayal or bravery. But in the important rooms, the study with the pattern, the kitchen with the coffee pot, the calm between father and son, there was just life being lived with the untidy, knotted heart that families are made of. Ridge's remorse didn't disappear overnight. It existed in him as an awareness, the kind that makes men nicer without making them weak. In the bright, tiny hours after confession, he discovered that the best stewardship might occasionally take the form of permission. He discovered that safeguarding a legacy is less about preserving a picture and more about preserving the people who give that image meaning. And Eric? He sewed, like men who pray by making things, and Katie wore the dress, looking as if anybody gazing at her had witnessed a minor miracle. Garments. After all, maybe miracles when they make a person feel like themselves. The city commended the photo editor's eye, and the charity raised funds. The Forrester household returned to its orbit of rivalry and affection, successes and minor wounds, and the family continued on, not always better, but sometimes wiser. When the storm had passed, and the press had moved on to the next costume drama, Ridge sat with Liam on the terrace at sunset, allowing the guilt to transform into a story he could tell without flinching. "I thought I was protecting him," Ridge remarked gently, letting the light wash over the garden. "I didn't consider what he needed. I was selfish." Liam placed a hand on his father's arm. "You fixed it," he murmured softly but not sweetly. "You could have kept pretending. Instead, you learned." Ridge grinned, not triumphantly, but gratefully. "We all get a chance to learn," he remarked. "Even me." Liam stared out at the Forrester skyline, a city that had given them much, while also taking more than it should. He reflected on patterns and hemlines, disagreements and apologies, and the peculiar and necessary task of keeping a house together, which was ultimately only as good as the people who lived in it. And across Los Angeles, the charity images would be published, critics would compare sleeves, and Katie would go on to live her life in a dress that fit her, not because of the controversy, but because someone had taken the time to make it so. For the Forresters, the lesson was smaller and more difficult. Sometimes stewardship isn't about saying no. Sometimes it's saying yes at the appropriate time, and sometimes it's having the humility to accept that your no was the thing that sent someone else looking for a way out. On Wednesday night, as the city lights came on and the Forrester house settled into its daily routine, Eric put his pattern away and looked up to see Ridge in the doorway. "Are you proud?" Ridge inquired, not with the usual barbs, but with the sincerity of a son. Eric's response was quiet and sincere. "Yes," he answered, also a little fatigued, but proud. "That was a good day." Ridge exhaled, and the sound was not a defense. It was a tiny sacrifice for a better way. They had lost a bit to the media, but gained a far bigger prize, a newfound knowledge that a family and a house lives through the hands that keep working, the humility of apologies, and the fortitude to let the maker make.